I want to start by telling you what she looked like before any of it happened. Before the auction, before the king, before the whole galaxy seemed to take a breath and hold it. I want you to picture her the way I first saw her, because if you don't start there, none of the rest of it makes sense. She was standing near the east loading dock of Terminus Station Zethara, which is, for those of you who have never had the misfortune of passing through, about the most miserable transit hub in the outer spiral arm. I say that without exaggeration. The station was built something like 400 years ago by a consortium of mining companies who wanted a waypoint between the Kareth belt and the inner trade routes, and it shows. The walls sweat. There are sections of the lower decks where the atmospheric recyclers haven't worked properly since my grandmother was a child. The whole place smells like recycled coolant and fried protein, and something else I never quite identified, something metallic and old. I was working logistics that cycle. My job was to cross-reference incoming cargo manifests with the auction house intake lists, which sounds straightforward until you realize that the Zethara auction house, the only auction house on the station, technically called the Consolidated Heritage and Commerce Exchange, but which everyone just called the Pit, had a filing system that made no sense to anyone alive or dead. Every intake log was handwritten on physical data sheets because the house's head administrator, a Drevak named Counselor Orath, believed digital records were vulnerable to manipulation. Which was ironic, given what I later learned about how he ran the place. But that's not the story I'm here to tell. I was elbow-deep in a stack of intake logs when I heard the family arrive. You always heard them before you saw them. Not because they were loud exactly. It was more that they had a particular quality of noise. The kind that fills space not with warmth but with a kind of aggressive claiming, like the air owed them something. The Vasaris. Old family, old money, or what passed for it in the outer spiral. They'd made their fortune in rare mineral extraction a few generations back, and they had the particular self-assurance of people who hadn't personally done any of the hard work and had spent long enough watching other people do it that they'd started to believe the work itself was beneath them. There were 5 of them that day. The patriarch, Edmur Vasari, who wore his age like a complaint. His wife, Sulis, who had the smile of someone who'd practiced it so long it no longer reached anything behind her eyes. Their 2 adult sons, Petter and Devin, who moved through the station like they were waiting for someone to tell them how impressive they were. And then, behind all of them, half a step back, carrying 2 bags that clearly belonged to other people. Nara. She was 23, maybe 24. I found out later she was 24. She had dark hair pulled back in the kind of practical knot that suggests you stopped spending time on your appearance somewhere around the point you stopped expecting anyone to look at you with anything but dismissal. Her clothes were clean but worn, the kind of second-hand quality that someone with pride but no money manages. She had a small bruise on her left wrist. She told me later it was from one of the cargo lifts in the lower dock where she'd been working an extra shift. But at the time, I just noticed it, and noticed that nobody in her family seemed to notice it or care. She was carrying the bags, both of them, and she was watching where she was going, not where they were going. Like her job was to make sure nobody tripped, not to be included in the trip. I watched them walk past my station. Edmur was already arguing about something with Petter. Sulis was consulting her personal comm. Devin was laughing at something Petter had said. Nara was watching the floor and carrying the bags. Nobody looked at her. That's the thing I remember most clearly. Not any single dramatic moment. Just that in those first 30 seconds of watching this family move through the station, not one of them looked at Nara once. I found out the details in pieces over the next few hours. The way you do when you work a station long enough that information just drifts to you. The Vasaris had an item in the auction, a significant one. They'd brought it in 2 days prior through a freight courier, and it had been logged into the Pit's secure holding before my shift started. I'd actually processed the paperwork without knowing who it belonged to. The item was listed on the intake form as 1 Pre-consolidation navigation crystal, Velt class intact, provenance documentation attached. Navigation crystals from before the consolidation were rare. Genuinely rare, not the performed rarity that auction houses like to manufacture to drive up prices. The consolidation era, the period roughly 4 centuries ago, when the major galactic governments merged their navigational infrastructure into the unified hyperpath grid, had rendered most of the older wayfinding technology obsolete overnight. Most of the old crystals had been destroyed or integrated into the new grid. The ones that survived, intact and unmodified, were museum pieces, scientific curiosities, sometimes used by collectors or by fringe communities that didn't trust the grid. And sometimes, though this was not widely discussed in polite company, used by individuals or organizations who wanted to travel routes that weren't on the grid, who wanted, in other words, to go somewhere without the hyperpath authority knowing they'd gone. That second category of buyer was why the pit did such good business. The Vasaris crystal, if the provenance documents held up, was estimated at somewhere between 80 and 120 million credits. Not enough to make a great house wealthy. Enough to rescue a struggling one. I gathered over the course of the morning that the Vasari finances were not what they'd once been. The mining operations had contracted. There'd been something 3 years ago, some failed investment that people mentioned in lowered voices. The family still had the name and the bearing and the ancestral property on Karath 4, but the accounts were in a state that required something like a navigation crystal to set right. What I didn't gather until later, until Nara herself told me, days after the auction, sitting in the small commissary near the East Dock with her hands wrapped around a cup of station tea that was barely better than hot water, was how the crystal had come to be in the family's possession in the first place. It was hers. Not in a sentimental way. Not in the way that people sometimes say something is theirs because they found it or loved it or feel attached to it. In the literal, legal, documented sense. The crystal had belonged to her grandmother, Nara's mother's mother, a woman named Sepha Murrin who had worked as a navigator on pre-consolidation freight routes and had been given the crystal by her captain when the hyperpath grid came online and made their ship's old navigation rig obsolete. Sepha had kept it. Sepha had logged it. Sepha had, when she died 18 years before the auction, passed it specifically and in writing to her granddaughter Nara. The will was clear, the documentation existed, Nara had copies. What Nara did not have was the money or the legal standing or the family support to contest what had happened next, which was that Edmure Vasari, her father by blood, though that word felt thin when she said it, had declared the crystal a family asset. Had the documentation altered by a solicitor he'd paid enough to stop asking questions, and had brought it to Zethara to sell. He had done this, Nara told me, with the same energy he applied to every decision about her, without discussion, without acknowledgement, without seeming to believe that her objection was worth the air it would take to dismiss. She'd come along because she'd thought or hoped, which is a different thing, that being present might change something. That her father might look at her and remember that the crystal had been her grandmother's gift to her and feel something about that. Shame or guilt or even discomfort. She'd also come, she admitted, because she didn't have anywhere else to be. The extra cargo shift was real. The bruise on her wrist was real. But the truth was that she'd packed a bag and followed her family to Zethara because she was 24 years old and she still, despite everything, wanted to believe that she was part of this family rather than a fixture in it. I understand that. I've understood it my whole life in smaller ways. The hope that presence means belonging, that proximity is a form of love. It isn't, but you have to learn that the hard way usually. The auction was scheduled for the 14th hour of the station cycle, which in Zethara's artificial day roughly corresponded to early evening. The pit occupied a large amphitheater space in the mid-station commercial ring, with tiered seating and a raised platform at the center where items were displayed. The lighting in the pit was always theatrical, warm amber at the edges, brighter and cooler at the center, calculated to make items look their best and bidders look mysterious. By the time the cycle reached the 12th hour, the station had changed in character. I'd worked Zathara for 3 years at that point, and I knew what the approach of a major auction did to the station's atmosphere. People came in from the docking rings. Private ships that had been logged as transiting would suddenly drop into extended berth. The commissaries would fill with people who weren't eating, who were nursing drinks and watching the room with the particular alertness of individuals who had something to spend or something to gain. That cycle, the atmosphere shift was more pronounced than usual. I noticed it first around the 13th hour when I took my break and walked through the commercial ring to get something from the food concession near the pit's east entrance. The concession was crowded but quiet. People were talking in the careful voices of individuals who know they're being overheard and have adjusted accordingly. I noticed an unusual number of personal security personnel. Not station security, I knew all of them by name or face, but the private kind. The kind that stands just far enough away from a principal to be deniable. I noticed 3 separate individuals at 3 separate tables who each had that particular stillness that trained security people have, the kind that looks like relaxation but isn't. I noticed a group of 4 individuals in the light gray uniforms of Consolidated Diplomatic Service personnel, which was unusual because Zathara didn't have a diplomatic office, and as far as I knew hadn't been briefed to expect one. And then I noticed something else. 2 individuals near the entrance of the pit itself, standing, not moving, not eating or drinking or consulting their comms, just standing and watching. They were tall, that was the first thing. Not unusually so in absolute terms, but there was something about the proportion of them, the way they occupied space, that made them read as tall even before you measured them against anything else. They wore dark, which everyone wears dark on a station because dark doesn't show the grime, but theirs was a particular dark, a fabric that seemed to absorb the amber lighting of the ring rather than reflecting it. Their faces were, I want to be precise here, composed. Not blank, not expressionless. Composed in the sense of a piece of music is composed, with intention and structure and a quality of control that suggests enormous effort rendered invisible. I almost walked past them. I almost filed them away in the part of my brain that processes, unusual but not my problem, and moved on. But one of them turned and looked at me. And I stopped. I have been looked at many times in my life. I've been looked at by people who wanted something from me, people who were evaluating me, people who liked me or disliked me, or simply processed my presence as information. But I had never, and haven't since, been looked at the way that individual looked at me in that moment. It wasn't threatening. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't even particularly intense in the dramatic way you might imagine. It was more that the look contained a completeness of attention that I wasn't prepared for, like being seen, genuinely and entirely, by something that saw clearly. I looked away first. I walked to the food concession. I bought my food. I ate it without tasting it and went back to my station. It was only later, talking to other station staff, that I learned what I'd been looking at. The Karath Knight. That was the name most people in the outer spiral used. The formal name, the one used in diplomatic correspondence and archival records, and the kinds of historical documents that nobody read until something happened that made you need to, was the Vassir Eternal Court, which was itself a translation of something in an older language that didn't translate perfectly into any of the standard galactic tongues. The closest approximation, according to the linguistic scholars who'd written about it, was something like, the ones who remember the dark before the first sun. Vampires, in the common parlance, though if you used that word within earshot of any of their kind and you hadn't been introduced, You'd receive a look that made the one I'd gotten at the food concession feel like a warm greeting. I knew about them the way most people in the outer spiral did, vaguely and partially, and with the particular confidence of someone who has absorbed misinformation without knowing its provenance. I knew they were very old. I knew they were not human in the biological sense, though they'd originated in a human population somewhere in the early pre-space era. The historical records were contested, deliberately so, I later learned, because the court had spent considerable energy making sure their origin story stayed murky. I knew they were politically neutral in the current sense, meaning they didn't participate in the consolidated authority governance structure, but they also weren't hostile to it. They operated under their own framework. They had their own territories, their own laws, their own economy. And they came to auctions sometimes, when something interested them. The question of what had interested them at Zethara's pit on that particular cycle was one that several people were quietly and urgently trying to answer in the hours before the auction began. The navigation crystal was the obvious answer, and it turned out, in the way that obvious answers sometimes do, to be both correct and incomplete. Nara had told me, later, about the family's mood in the hours before the auction. Edmer was tense, which for him meant he became very still and very precise in his speech, clipping words short like he was rationing them. Sulis had moved into a performance of calm that Nara recognized as its own form of anxiety, the careful arranging of clothing, the repeated checking of documentation, the refusal to acknowledge that any of it mattered while behaving in every physical way as if it mattered enormously. Petter and Devin had taken to making jokes that weren't quite cruel enough to require response, but which accumulated, over the course of hours, into something that sat on Nara like weight. The jokes were about her mostly, or adjacent to her. Comments about the crystal, about how lucky it was that the family had properly secured it. Comments about the solicitor's paperwork, about how much simpler things were when documentation was handled correctly. Comments delivered to each other nominally, but calibrated to ensure she heard them. She sat in the holding room the pit provided for consignors, and she heard them, and she did not say anything. I asked her later why she didn't say anything. She said she'd tried once, about a year before, had sat her father down and tried to say, clearly and directly and without anger, that the crystal was hers, that her grandmother had left it to her, that she wanted it back or wanted at minimum to be part of the decision about what happened to it. Edmer had listened to her with the expression of someone enduring a minor inconvenience. Then he'd said, "You've always been dramatic, Nara," and left the room. She hadn't tried again after that, not because she'd given up exactly, but because she'd understood something in that moment about what kind of effort was worth making and where. You don't keep throwing yourself at a wall that doesn't have a door. You find another way, or you accept the wall, and she was still in the process of figuring out which of those it would be for her. The 14th hour came. The pit filled. I was not supposed to be there. My shift was logistics, not event support. But I'd finished my manifest reviews early, and the event coordinator, a harried Velen named Torsk, who owed me a favor from a previous cycle when I'd helped him locate a misrouted container, told me I could stand in the back with the floor staff if I wanted to watch. I wanted to watch. I didn't know why exactly. I just had the feeling that something was happening and that I would regret not seeing it. The pit's amphitheater held maybe 300 people at capacity. That cycle, it was close to full. The tiers were arranged in a rough semicircle around the central platform, and from my position at the back of the floor, I could see most of the room. I could see the Vassaris in the front consignors section. Edmer and Suli seated, Petter and Devin standing slightly behind, Nara standing slightly behind them, her hands folded in front of her, her face composed in the way that people compose their faces when they've decided that nothing that happens is going to show on them. I could see the diplomatic service personnel seated together in the middle tier. their gray uniforms conspicuous against the darker formal wear of the other bidders. And I could see, in the elevated side section, that the pit reserved for bidders who wanted privacy, usually separated from the main floor by a screen of decorative metalwork, two figures in dark clothing. The Carath Knight. The two individuals I'd seen at the entrance earlier, and with them, a third. The third one had not been at the entrance. I would have remembered. I had catalogued the first two with some effort of will, some deliberate filing away of the unusual. The third one I could not have catalogued because the third one was the kind of thing your brain doesn't quite file. It experiences it, and then takes a moment to catch up with itself. He was seated, perfectly still. The decorative metalwork of the screen cast a pattern of shadow across him that was almost too convenient, almost too precisely arranged, and I had the irrational thought that the shadow had positioned itself around him rather than the other way around. He was dressed in what I would later understand was a formality of attire that among his people indicated significant rank, though to my eyes it simply read as black and old and extraordinary, the kind of garment that has been worn and cared for long enough that it has become something beyond clothing. His face, where the light reached it, was, I am going to try to be honest here and say that I cannot adequately describe it. Not because it was inhumanly strange. It wasn't. It was recognizably a face. Recognizably in the basic structural sense, human-derived. But it had been on the other side of time for long enough that time had done something to it that I don't have the vocabulary for. It had been refined, clarified. Not aged, that's the wrong word, because aging implies deterioration. It had been clarified the way a broth is clarified. Everything that was not essential had been removed. He was looking at the platform. He was not looking at anything else. He was waiting. The auction ran for 2 hours before they reached the navigation crystal. Zethara's pit was a full-service auction house, meaning they moved through a range of lots before the featured items. I watched ceramic funerary urns from a pre-consolidation colony world go to a collector from the inner systems for 11,000 credits. I watched a set of early consolidation military commendations, the physical kind, made of actual metal, from a period before everything went digital, generate a bidding war between the diplomatic service personnel and a private individual in the upper tier. I watched a piece of scanning equipment from a decommissioned survey vessel sell for much less than its reserve, which caused a visible ripple of anxiety through the auctioneer's expression that he covered professionally and quickly. Through all of it, the figure in the elevated section did not move, did not consult anything, did not speak to the two individuals beside him. He watched the platform with a patience that did not feel like waiting. It felt like a different relationship to time entirely. I watched him watching. And then, sometime in the second hour, I noticed that he wasn't looking at the platform anymore. He was looking at Nara. I want to be careful here because I know how that sounds. The dramatic moment, the ancient powerful being and the overlooked girl and the meaningful gaze across a crowded room. I know how it reads. I also know what I saw, and what I saw was not romantic in the moment. It was stranger than that. He was watching her the way I'd seen him watching the platform, with that complete attention, that quality of seeing that I'd gotten a fraction of when one of his companions had glanced at me near the entrance, but sustained and directed. She wasn't doing anything notable. She was standing where she'd been standing, slightly behind her family, hands folded, watching the auction with the careful neutrality of someone who has decided to observe rather than feel. But something about her, something I couldn't identify from my position at the back of the floor, had caught his attention and was holding it. I watched him watching her, and I saw the moment she felt it. It was subtle, a slight shift in her posture, a faint tension at the line of her shoulders, the kind that happens when you become aware of being watched without knowing where the watching is coming from. She didn't look around immediately. She stayed still for a few seconds, processing. Then, carefully, the way you do when you don't want to look like you're looking, she glanced toward the elevated section. She looked directly at him. I don't know what she saw. I was too far away to see her face clearly, but she held the look for a moment longer than the casual glance it had started as, and then she looked back at the platform and something in her posture had changed. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anything dramatic. It was more like, I've thought about this a lot and the best I can do is this. Like she'd been holding herself at a slight remove from the room, at a safe distance, and something had just reminded her that she was actually in it. Part 2. The price of the thing. The navigation crystal lot came up at the 16th hour. Counselor Orath himself took the podium for it, which was unusual. He was a large Drevak with a purple-gray complexion and the practiced gravity of someone who understood theater. He talked about the crystal for 3 minutes before opening the bidding, and he talked well: provenance, rarity, condition, the historical significance of pre-consolidation wayfinding technology, the practical applications for scientific study. He did not talk about the less institutional applications. He didn't need to. Everyone in the room already knew. The starting bid was set at 60 million credits. The diplomatic service personnel opened immediately at 62. A private bidder in the upper tier came in at 65. There was a pause, and then the diplomatic service came back at 70. Edmer Vasari, in the front consignors section, was very still. Sulis had her hands folded in her lap in a mirror of Nara's posture, though the dynamic between the two poses was completely different. Petter and Devin had stopped talking. The bidding moved. 72 from the private bidder, 78 from the diplomatic service, a new voice from somewhere in the middle tier at 80, 83 from the private bidder, 87 from the diplomatic service. 90 million credits from the elevated section. It was not the amount that changed the atmosphere in the room. 90 million was within the expected range. It was the voice. Or perhaps not the voice itself. The bid was submitted through the house's electronic system, a number that appeared on the display board without dramatics, but the knowledge of where it came from. The information moved through the room the way information moves through a closed space, quickly and without needing to be spoken aloud. People knew, and the knowledge changed the temperature of the bidding. The diplomatic service came back at 94. 98 from the elevated section. A pause, a longer pause than any of the previous ones. 102 from the diplomatic service. 110 from the elevated section. The private bidder in the upper tier was done. I saw them sit back, a physical gesture of withdrawal. The diplomatic service personnel conferred in the careful way of people who are consulting a limit they've been given and finding themselves at it. The new voice from the middle tier was long gone. 110 million credits. The room held. Counselor Orath did his theatrical pause, his going once, going twice performance. The diplomatic service did not respond. The crystal sold. What happened next was not, in a technical sense, unusual for a high-value auction lot. The buyer's representative approached the consignor to handle the formalities of transfer, signatures, authentication of provenance documentation, confirmation of payment timeline. It was paperwork. It was process. What was unusual was that the buyer's representative was not one of the two individuals who'd been sitting in the elevated section. It was him. He had come down from the elevated section himself, which, according to the house staff I spoke to later, was essentially unheard of for a principal of his rank. Buyers at that level sent representatives. Buyers at that level did not personally stand at the consignor table doing paperwork. He stood at the table. Edmer Vasari shook his hand with the expression of someone trying to decide whether this was a good sign or a bad one, and not having enough information to determine which. Suli smiled her practiced smile. Petter and Devin positioned themselves with the instinctive social maneuvering of men who sensed proximity to power, and wanted to be adjacent to it. The authentication proceeded. Documents were examined. There were several minutes of the careful, quiet back and forth of high-value commerce. And then it stopped. It stopped because the buyer had turned to the provenance documentation, the physical documentation, the datasheets attached to the crystal's case, and was reading something. Reading it with that quality of attention that left no room for anything else in the vicinity. He read for 30 seconds, maybe 40. Then he looked up. He did not look at Edmer. He looked at Nara. She was standing at the edge of the consignor's space, slightly back from the table, because that was where she'd been standing all day. At the edge of things. Present enough to be fetched if something was needed, far enough back to be excluded from the actual proceedings. He looked at her and said something. He said it quietly. I was not close enough to hear it. The witnesses who were closer, 3 house staff members, one of whom gave us a partial account, said that it was quiet enough that they weren't entirely certain of the words. What they agreed on was the tone. Not harsh, not demanding, more like a question that already knew its answer and was asking out of courtesy. What he said, as best as the accounts agree, was, "This documentation refers to Asefa Murrin. What is your relationship to her?" The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. 4 seconds is not a long time, but in that particular configuration of people, in that particular location, with that particular quality of attention directed at it, 4 seconds was enough to reorganize the room. Nara said, clearly and without hesitation, "She was my grandmother." Edmer started to say something. I am told, the house staff member who gave the account was quite clear on this, that Edmer started to say something and then did not finish it. Not because anyone stopped him, because the buyer turned his head very slightly in Edmer's direction, not quite looking at him, and the sentence died. The buyer turned back to Nara. He said, "The bequest notation on this document indicates the crystal was willed specifically to you, not to the Vasari family estate, to you by name." Nara said, "Yes." He looked at the documentation for another moment. Then he looked at Edmer. He said nothing to Edmer, not a word, but people who were present, and I've spoken to 3 of them, described what happened in that look in similar terms. One said it was like being measured and found to be a very small amount. One said it was like a door closing. One, who was perhaps the most literary of the 3, said it was like being seen completely and dismissed not with contempt but with something colder than contempt, which is simple, accurate assessment. Then the buyer turned back to Counselor Orath and said, clearly, for the room to hear, "I'd like to pause the transfer pending a documentation review." What followed was 3 hours of the most intense bureaucratic activity I've ever witnessed on a station that has a fair amount of bureaucratic activity. The buyer, and I should say at this point that his name was known to the Pitt senior staff, who had been informed ahead of the auction, and who had treated the information with the discretion of people who understood what it meant. His name was Valdris. That was the version that worked in standard galactic lingua. The full formal name and its proper pronunciation required a different understanding of language than most people had, and he had apparently long since stopped expecting anyone to attempt it. Valdris was what people said, and it seemed to be what he answered to, at least in contexts like this one. Valdris had, through his representatives, contacted the station's legal and records office within an hour of the sale. He had requested, with the particular quality of request that arrives with the weight of 10,000 years of institutional authority behind it, which is to say it arrived as a request, and was understood immediately as a determination, that the provenance documentation for the navigation crystal be cross-referenced against any existing bequest records for one Asefa Murrin. The records office found the bequest record in 40 minutes. It had not been destroyed. The solicitor Edmer had paid had altered the family documentation, yes, had created a set of papers that made the crystal appear to be a general family asset rather than a specific bequest. But he had not, whether from incompetence or a faint remnant of professional ethics, gone into the outer system records and removed the original filing. Sepha Murren's will was on record. The bequest to Nara was on record, specific, named, documented. The sale of the navigation crystal was, under consolidated authority property law, unlawful. Edmur Vasari said a great many things during those 3 hours. He said them to Councillor Orath, to the legal office representative, to his own solicitor through a calm channel, to Petter and Devin in urgent whispers. He did not say any of them to Nara. Nara sat in the pit's waiting area. She had been asked to remain on station while the review proceeded, which she had agreed to without visible reaction. She sat with her hands in her lap and she waited. I sat with her for part of it. I don't know why she let me. Maybe because I wasn't part of any of it and she needed someone in her vicinity who wasn't. She didn't say much, I didn't say much. At one point she said, without looking at me, I didn't think anything would actually happen. I asked her what she meant. She said, when he asked me about my grandmother, I answered honestly. I always answer honestly. She paused. Usually nothing happens because of it. Part 3. What IT cost and what IT cost. This is the part that is harder to explain. Not because it's complicated, exactly. The mechanics of it are straightforward enough. The documentation review confirmed the unlawful sale. Under consolidated authority law, that meant the sale was voided. The crystal should have reverted to Nara as the rightful owner. The Vasaris should have been referred to the appropriate legal bodies for the matter of the forged documentation. The mechanics were clear. What's harder to explain is everything that surrounded the mechanics, the texture of it, the quality of what happened in the spaces between the formal proceedings. Valdres had removed himself from the main proceedings after initiating the documentation review. He had gone back to the elevated section, and his people had created the kind of quiet perimeter around him that suggested the proceedings would resolve themselves appropriately, and that his direct involvement was no longer required. But there was a point. The legal office representative told me this later, in one of those after-the-fact conversations where people who witness something are still processing it and want to put the pieces in order. There was a point at which the Vasaris solicitor, working remotely, had found a technical argument, a procedural gap in the way the outer system bequest records interfaced with the station's legal jurisdiction. The argument was not strong, but it was real, and it was the kind of argument that, in the ordinary course of legal proceedings, required time to contest. Weeks, maybe. Long enough that the crystal would remain in administrative limbo, and administrative limbo, in Edmur's calculation, might be turned to his advantage. The legal office representative had explained this situation to Councillor Orath, who had explained it to Valdres's senior representative, who had relayed it. And Valdres had made a decision. What he had decided, and this is the part that people talked about on the station for months afterward, in the way that things get talked about when they exceed what people expected, was this. He had purchased the navigation crystal lawfully at auction for 110 million credits. That purchase was now voided. He could have walked away. He had every legitimate reason to walk away. He had spent a significant sum on an item that could no longer be transferred to him, through no fault of his own, and he could have contested the voiding, could have argued that the auction house bore responsibility for the fraudulent documentation, could have pursued any number of avenues that were, given the scale of his resources and authority, readily available to him. He did not do any of that. What he did was this. He had his representative contact the station's legal office and indicate that the Vasari family, in light of the documentation irregularities, was prepared to make full restitution to the rightful owner of the crystal. Not the legal office. Not the consolidated authority. Nara. When I say full restitution, I mean the value of the crystal, not the sale price. The full assessed market value, which the appraisal documentation submitted as part of the auction lot had placed at 117 million credits. Valdres had, in short, paid for the crystal on Nara's behalf. The money was not his liability. He had no legal obligation. The Vassaris were the ones who owed the restitution. But the Vassaris did not have 117 million credits, and pursuing them for it through legal channels would take years and would likely end in something much smaller than the full amount, if anything at all. Valdres had the money. Valdres had transferred it. Valdres had done it without fanfare or announcement, through channels that a legal office functionary discovered in the paperwork and mentioned to Councillor Orath, and which then spread through the station's staff with the particular velocity of information that doesn't quite make sense and therefore demands to be shared. The legal office representative who told me about it said, near the end of our conversation, "The thing I can't get past is that he just did it, not to be seen doing it. The paperwork didn't even have his name on it in the obvious place. It was buried. If the clerk hadn't looked at the transfer origin, nobody would have known where it came from." I thought about that for a long time. I still think about it. Nara was informed of the outcome formally, by the legal office representative, in the waiting area where I'd been sitting with her. She listened to the full explanation, the void of the sale, the documentation finding, the restitution transfer, the amount. She asked one question: why did he do it? The representative said she didn't know. Nara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Did he know my grandmother?" That question, I wasn't expecting it. Neither was the representative. There was a pause while we both processed what she'd asked and why she'd asked it, and what it meant that she'd asked it before asking anything else. The representative said she'd have to look into it. She did look into it. Not immediately. There were still proceedings to finish, forms to sign, arrangements to make for the physical transfer of the crystal to Nara, and the referral of the Vasari documentation case to the appropriate investigative body, which Edmer and Sulis and Petter and Devin were dealing with in a different part of the station, with expressions I was sorry not to witness directly. But later. She found something in the Vassar Eternal Court's public record, the portion of it that was accessible, which was a small fraction of the whole. A navigation route, pre-consolidation. A freight vessel named the Murren Star. A record of passage, somewhere in a spiral arm that no longer had its original name, through a system that was now under the jurisdiction of what translated roughly as the eastern reaches of the Vassar territories. A record of assistance rendered in a moment of navigational emergency by the crew of the Murren Star. The captain is listed. The navigator is listed. The navigator's name is Sepha Murren. The record does not say what the emergency was. It does not say exactly what Sepha Murren did. It says only that the debt incurred by the Eternal Court to the crew of the Murren Star had been logged in the court's formal record of obligations, which among the Vassar was not a sentimental notation, but a binding institutional commitment. They kept debts. Not in the human sense of financial obligation, in the older sense, in the sense that mattered across centuries rather than quarterly reports. Sepha Murren had helped someone or something that mattered to the court, some decades before the consolidation, and the court had logged it and carried it and been carrying it for long enough that the woman herself was gone, and her daughter was gone, and only her granddaughter remained. And the granddaughter had been wronged. I asked to see him before he left the station. This was an extraordinary thing to ask. I want to be clear that I understood it was extraordinary. I was a logistics technician on a mid-tier transit station. He was, there isn't a clean way to say this, he was the kind of thing that the universe doesn't have a great framework for. Old in a way that recontextualizes what old means. Powerful in a way that doesn't map onto political power charts. I asked anyway, through Councillor Orath, who looked at me like I'd asked to personally address a star. Oreth came back 20 minutes later with an expression I hadn't seen on him before. He said, "He'll see you. His people seem to be expecting you to ask." That detail has stayed with me. I was shown to a small meeting room off the pit's administrative corridor. Not the elevated section, just a room. A table and chairs and the station's recycled air, and the particular kind of quiet that occurs in spaces set apart from the noise of a busy hub. He was already there. One of his companions stood at the door. The other was not visible. He was standing at the window, a narrow viewport that looked out at the docking arm rather than at space, which meant the view was mostly the external hull of a berthed cargo ship and some structural supports, and I remember thinking that it was a very ordinary view for someone standing in it. He turned when I came in. I said, without planning to say it that way, "I need to understand why you did it." He looked at me, that look. He said, "You're asking on her behalf or your own?" I thought about it. I said, "Both, I think." He considered that for a moment. Then he said, in the even and careful way of someone translating not between languages but between frameworks of thought, "There are obligations in the world that do not expire when the person who created them does. Your institutions understand this imperfectly. Debt passes through families, through law, through time. The obligation we carried to Sepha Murrin did not end with her. It passed to what she cared for, what remained of her." I said, "Her granddaughter." He said, "Her granddaughter was robbed by her own family of the things Sepha left her. The obligation we carried included the obligation to see the record corrected." I said, "But you spent over 100 million credits." He said, "And I will carry this for the rest of my life. The amount is not the point of the gesture. The gesture is the point of the gesture." He paused. Then he said, "She answered me honestly when I asked her about her grandmother. She didn't know who I was or what I could do. She simply told the truth because it was true. That quality is worth more than the amount you're citing." There is an afterward. There's always an afterward, and it's rarely as clean as what comes before it. The Vasari documentation case moved through the legal system with the particular speed of cases that have attracted attention from sources that the legal system would prefer not to disappoint. Edmer was found guilty of fraud and property misappropriation approximately 14 months after the auction. He received a significant fine and a suspended custodial sentence, which in the outer spiral's legal system passed for meaningful consequence. The solicitor who'd altered the documents lost his license. Sulis and the two sons were not directly implicated, which was probably accurate in terms of their legal culpability and almost certainly incomplete in terms of their actual knowledge and complicity. These things are sometimes the same and sometimes not. Nara received the navigation crystal. Physically, actually received it. It was placed in her hands in a brief ceremony that the legal office conducted with more warmth than I expected from a legal office, because everyone who'd been involved in the case had by that point formed an opinion about Nara that tended toward warmth. She also received the restitution funds, 117 million credits, minus the legal costs of the proceeding, which were themselves covered by the Consolidated Authorities Fraud Victim Assistance Program, leaving the full amount essentially intact. She sat with it for a while, not the money, the crystal. She held it in the pit's waiting area, in the same chair where she'd waited for 3 hours while the documentation review proceeded. She held it and looked at it for a long time. It was smaller than you'd expect for something that had upended an afternoon. The size of 2 fists put together, deep blue, almost black, with an internal luminescence that was a property of the crystal itself, not of any external light source. It threw small moving patterns on her hands. I was there. I don't know why she let me be there for that either. Maybe for the same reason as before. She said eventually, she used this to navigate. I said yes. She said she went places with this, places she knew exactly where she was going. I said yes. She looked at the light moving on her hands. She said, "I've never really known where I was going." I didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. Some things are complete without a response. She left the station 4 days later. She had in those 4 days made arrangements, with an efficiency that I found in retrospect entirely consistent with who she was, someone who had learned to do things quietly and quickly before anyone noticed and withdrew the opportunity. That involved a small investment in a navigation consulting operation on one of the inner trade routes. Something that would use her existing logistics training and her newly, officially documented ownership of a pre-consolidation Velt-class navigation crystal that certain research institutions and certain independent operators were very interested in consulting on. She also left for the station records her contact information, which I have, and which I am not going to include in this archival account because it is not mine to give, but which exists. She did not leave a message for her family. The morning she left, I walked with her to the docking ring. Her bag was her own this time. She was carrying it herself, and it was the right size for one person going one direction. At the dock entrance, she turned and looked back at the station, at the recycled air corridors and the sweating walls and the food concession, by the pit's east entrance and all of it. She said, "I never would have done it for myself, you know." I said I thought she would have, eventually. She shook her head. "Maybe, but it would have taken longer, long enough that something else would have gone wrong." She paused. "He didn't do it for me, really. He did it because of my grandmother." I said, "Does that matter?" She thought about it, honestly thought about it in the way she did things. She said, "No, I don't think it does. Whatever the reason the thing happened, the thing is real." She went through the dock entrance. I watched the loading indicators until her berth showed as cleared. Final notation. Archivist Peladoon, Oral History Division notes. The primary witness, Myra Solon, provided the foregoing account across 11 sessions conducted over 3 months. Her recollection is detailed and consistent across sessions, with minor variations in phrasing that suggest genuine memory rather than rehearsed testimony. We have attempted to locate Valdres, or a representative of the Vasseur Eternal Court, for comment or additional testimony. We received a brief written response that confirmed the accuracy of the bequest record and the debt of obligation notation. The response contained one additional sentence that I include here because I believe it belongs in the record. The navigator Sepha Murren brought our people through a passage that no chart could have told her was safe. She trusted what she knew against what she could see, and she was right. We do not forget the ones who trust correctly. The navigation crystal's current location is not publicly documented. Nara Vasari declined to be interviewed for this account. That decision is recorded and respected. The events at Terminus Station Zethara on the 14th hour of cycle 7741 remain, to this office's knowledge, the only documented instance of the Vasseur Eternal Court directly intervening in a consolidated authority legal proceeding on behalf of a private individual. We leave the reader to draw their own conclusions about what that means. This account is submitted for permanent record. Archivist P. Doon, GHPA Oral History Division.